step forward so I can hear in case they're mumble. Please sit wherever you want.
Ladies and gentlemen, can I ask everyone to take your seats? So the first thing is, would everybody please put your cell phones to silent mode so it doesn't interrupt the service? In just a few minutes, the funeral is going to be conducted by Rabbi and also Cantor Stewart Deacon. not in good shape. However, Eugene was a proud member of the U.S. Coast Guard, and like the other branches of the service, the Coast Guard provides honors. So what we're going to do is we're going to rise up when the Coast Guard comes up forward, and when they play taps, please put your hand over your heart, unless you're a veteran, in which case you can salute. Everyone please rise. You may be seated.
behalf of the President of the United States Coast Guard, grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your welcome to honorable official service.
Friends, thank you for joining us to thank the members of the Coast Guard to invite you following the interment to come to the home of Mark and Janelle to fulfill the commandment of comforting the mourners in Chum Avelim. Chum Avelim. Can you hear me? This afternoon, we are here to mourn the passing, to honor and celebrate the life of Eugene Stopeck. Gene was an impressive man with a big personality and a big spirit, great sense of humor, just a big heart. He marched to the beat of his own drum. He was entrepreneurial and successful in all of his endeavors. He never demanded much for himself. He was always giving to everybody else, to his family, to his friends, to his community. He's really an incredible person, an extraordinary human being. Truth was and integrity were important to him, and he always said it as he saw it. Classy gentleman with an indomitable spirit. There always seemed to be a twinkle in his eye that said, "The world is my oyster." He was a consummate New Yorker, a person of substance and flair, cultured, self-contained, capable, a man with good values. He knew what he wanted from life and he made it happen. He made it happen for his family and for his friends. He had so many interests, from stocks to pianos to movies. He was playful and lighthearted with all of it. He felt he didn't take life too seriously, but he loved playing the game. He was 91 years old when he passed and lived a full and rich life. Devoted husband to Faye for 60 years, a loving companion to Lady for the past 5, a supportive father to Adam and Patty, to Mark and Janelle, caring grandfather to Isaac, Sophia, Finley, and Avital. He was a beloved member of our synagogue, where Faye and he were regulars after moving to Chicago and served on the board. Begin our service today with biblical readings, linking Gene to the long chain of his ancestors and to the tradition that was dear to him. Begin with a reading from Mishnah, who is honored, the one who honors, loves, and cares for other human beings. The deepest wisdom a person can attain is to know that his or her destiny is to aid, to serve. Reading from the Talmud, the Torah calls our attention to the fact that the Aron HaKodesh, which held the 10 Commandments, the Holy Ark, in the wilderness, was to be covered with gold, outside and inside. You could readily understand why the outside should be covered with gold. Decorations should be seen. What need, however, was there for gold on the inside? The commentators answer that the inside should be identical to the outside, tocho kevavo. And such is the case with goodness. Its open expression must be matched by an inner conviction. I think Gene was more of a sober guy than a gold guy. Finally, we'll have a reading of Ecclesiastes that will be read by his grandson, Isaac.
Season is set for everything, a time for every experience under heaven, a time for planting and a time for reaping, a time for keeping and a time for discarding, a time for loving and a time for hating.
Today is the last day of Chol Hamoed Sukkot, Jewish holiday. And it's our custom during Jewish holidays not to give eulogies, but we do share many stories and memories and thoughts about our dear, beloved, departed ones. We're going to first hear from Mark, and then Terry and Lena Meriden, Gene's dear friends from the condo building. Finally, I will share a few words.
So like 30 years ago, a little more than 30 years ago, I moved to Oak Park, and I started working at the Wednesday Journal. And one day, the receptionist said, "Mark, you have a call. It's from a man with a very thick foreign accent." And I said, "Well, put it through." And I pick up my phone, and it's, "Hello, Mark, it's Dad." You know, you didn't have to meet Gene for very long before you knew he was from Brooklyn. Pretty much as soon as he started talking. And you know, he proudly carried that accent, that Brooklyn accent, with him his whole life. And at times it was hard for him, even for Siri on his phone, to understand what he was saying. Try asking Siri for directions to Palm Desert. And it's, no matter how loud you say that, it won't give you the directions. Okay. So, Gene met my mother, Faye, in January of 1958. They were fixed up because by my father's Aunt Elsie, lived next door to my mother's Aunt B, which was they were in the same apartment building. They lived in neighboring apartments. And so it was a match that was done in the classic Jewish American style of being fixed up by aunts. And my father's Aunt Elsie, in also the classic Jewish matchmaking tradition, was not entirely truthful or forthcoming about who she was fixing him up with. She told my father that Faye was a blonde, which Faye was decidedly not. And she neglected to tell my 25-year-old father that Faye was still in high school. He did actually tell me that had he known that, he wouldn't have gone out on that date. I don't know, neither Faye nor Gene ever spoke much about their courtship, but my mother said one thing, which sort of became part of the family lore, which is when she first met my father, he told her that he, Eugene Stopeck, was the one who brought the mambo to Brooklyn. And, you know, he never denied that he said that. And my mother never really cannot remember the context in which he said it. I used to imagine that, you know, they were on a date, and the subject of dancing came up. My mother asked my father, do you dance? And my father said, can I dance? Baby, I brought the mambo to Brooklyn. Now, the thing about he obviously didn't bring the mambo to Brooklyn. But there is some truth to that statement. Because my father, he was the kind of guy who could have brought the mambo. Anybody who knew him or sat on a board with him, either the temple board at Oceanside Jewish Center, which he was on for 15 years. I don't even know how you get onto the temple board for 15 years, much less stay there for that long. And also the condo board at 990. If you're served on a board with Eugene Stopeck, you know that Gene was a guy who made things happen. So he was very enterprising, and he had ideas. He was not risk averse, and he took he was willing to take risks and chances. In 1961, so he'd been married for 3 years, he and a couple of guys that he worked with at Western Electric hatched an idea to start a business. The business my father named as Club B&B, or Club Bachelor and Bachelorette. To the end of his life, he claimed that he was the guy who coined the word bachelorette. And so Club Bachelor and Bachelorette in New York, what they did was they rented out, their plan was they would rent out ballrooms in hotels in New York, and they would have dances and parties and charge people. And it would be and they would maybe rotate to different hotels. And they did it. They did the first party in 1961 at the New Yorker Hotel. And they got a big crowd, several hundred people. He described that they had the piano on wheels that was rotated around the party, and had an open bar, and it was a big success. And the next day, he went and had dinner with his parents and his in-laws and my mother. And he told them what happened about this big success, about their, Club B&B. And they were appalled. And they told him, this is not a business for a married man. And he didn't do it again. Until 15 years later. And he started it at OJC, at Oceanside Jewish Center. And he was president of the Couples Club. And I can only imagine when he presented this idea. Like, what we need to do, he told them, was we need to have singles dances. And put an ad in the paper, and people from all over the New York area will come here, and we'll charge them, and we'll make money. And sure, Gene, go ahead. So Eugene Stopeck started the singles dance at the temple. And he placed an ad, and people from all over New York came to once a month for 2 years. And as he said, for 50 years later, he could still tell you how much the deal he got on the liquor. He bought those little airline boxes with the little tiny bottles of liquor And he was getting them for 60 cents a piece and selling them for $1. Right? So Gene never forgot what he paid for anything or what he sold it for. Right? He had a photographic memory for numbers. And, you know, apparently they made $1,000 a month. In the mid-70s, that was pretty good. And when you combine that with the Las Vegas nights that he ran, and his military bridge nights, which I still don't really know what that was, but he was probably the biggest fundraiser that the temple had in the decade of the 1970s. And I still remember him. I always knew, Adam and I both, we knew that it was singles dance night when my father would have on his red plaid blazer. And I remember being 10 years old and seeing him in that red plaid blazer. He was going to the singles dance. And I thought, this is my father, the nightclub owner. And he was in his element, and he was finally realizing, like, the squashed dream from Club B&B, right? And of course, my brother and I were a little bit traumatized by those because he couldn't put the phone number of the temple in the ad because there was nobody who would answer the temple on Saturday or Saturday night. So he put our home phone. And next to the phone, he put little pieces of paper with directions on how to get to OJC from Brooklyn, from Queens, from different points. And so people would call our house, and you know, and who knows what they thought, that like a child was answering the phone and telling them how to get there and reading them instructions. First, get to the Belt Parkway. So this was Gene's creation and his enterprise, and he made it happen. But a second feature of his personality, other than making things happen, was that Gene was adaptive. Gene found a way to love things that the people he loved. And probably the best example is with my mother. So Gene was not raised with much music. Yes, he claims he took accordion lessons briefly, where his mother gave him 15 cents and he had to take the subway to the accordion teacher. But he was certainly not raised with classical music. And among his peers that I knew that he grew up with, classical music was not really part of the world in which they lived. But my father falls in love with a classical pianist. And it doesn't take long for him to be all in. So they started dating in January. In September, he purchases their first subscription series to the New York Philharmonic. Before they were married. They were married in December of 1951. And they were married for 60 years. Probably at least 50 of those years involved a subscription to either the New York Philharmonic or the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. And it wasn't just that he was, humoring my mother. He became well-versed. And in the last few years, when Janelle and I would go with him and Lainey to the symphony, he picked the concerts, and he always picked the best concerts. And he was all in on my mother's piano teaching. I mean, aside, he helped with the recitals, he made his famous punch, pineapple juice, orange sherbet, and 7-Up. But he also, he bought my mother her second piano. My mother had one Steinway piano, and she wanted another second one so she could do 2 piano music, and my father bought that for her. And for years that my mother taught until 6 o'clock in the evening, my father came home at 5:15 and made dinner. He was as committed to her success as she was. And he became an authority on pianos. Gene could tell you the histories of all of these brands of pianos. Oh, that's a Mason Hamel. They used to be owned by Aeolian, and he goes through a long thing, and then he knew the sizes of all of the pianos and the different models, especially Steinway. And it got to a point where if you wanted a piano, Gene would find you a piano. And yes, he had Faye to test it out, but he was the guy who was always looking for pianos. When I was in 6th grade, and Adam was in 8th grade, we went on a vacation to the Catskills, and Adam and I learned how to ski. And we loved skiing. And, Gene just could have said, well, that's great, boys. You like skiing. You can go with youth groups and go skiing. But no, Gene was going to make sure that we got to go skiing all the time. And he got these discount lift tickets, and he drove us to Vernon Valley. And our friend Andrew Stark came, and then he got Andrew's father to also drive, and they were alternating weeks, driving us every week to Vernon Valley in New Jersey to go skiing. And within a few years, Gene and Marvin Stark, Andrew's father, concocted a plan to buy a ski house in Hunter, New York, or Hunter Mountain, like the premier Hunter Mountain, 3 hours north of New York. And it turned out to be one of the most successful 2 families going in on a vacation home that I could possibly imagine. And it was because Gene and Marvin made it happen. And Gene and Marvin, they were a great pair, because both of them were guys who were enterprising, and they both made it happen together. And that ski house was a really important part of our family. And as Adam once said, how many parents can say that they spent all weekend with their teenage sons every weekend? And that was it. That's what we did through high school. And just Gene made it happen. And at the time, I wasn't even aware of how much it was that he made happen. It's really only in hindsight that I thought, what an unusual circumstance that was. Another thing that was pivotal for Gene was when I was also in middle school in 6th grade, my art teacher on Long Island told my mother that she couldn't teach me anymore, and that I needed to go into Manhattan and take classes at the Art Students League. Okay, I don't necessarily, in hindsight, I don't necessarily agree with that assessment, but My father was the one who was going to drive me into Manhattan on Saturday mornings to go take art classes at the Art Students League for 3 hours. And during that time, he had 3 hours to kill. And about that's when he started going to auctions. And that was a pivotal time for him. And now, Gene was not known for his patience. If you knew my parents, you may have heard at some point the phrase, "Faye, we're leaving." Come on, Faye, we're leaving. Okay? But when I saw him one day in an auction, and auctions can be really boring, and he sat there totally absorbed, and he would write down the prices that everything sold for. So you want to know how Gene became an expert on antiques? He spent hundreds of hours sitting in auctions, writing down what things sold for, including opening bids. So he always knew. And from those auctions, he started his collection of antique sterling silver and other antiques. And that was the beginning of Gene Sterling, Gene's antique business. That's when I started thinking of my father. Oh, this is Eugene Stopeck, the antique dealer. And that, in the 90s, that became really his identity. And he was a guy who could make things happen. My mother was a great networker, so she brought a lot of customers with my father. And they would have different requirements. Gene, I have a set of Wallace Grand Baroque, and I need 4 more place settings. Or, it's missing 3 soup spoons. I remember that. He says, I have to find 3 soup spoons for someone. And Gene was the guy who could make that happen. See, nowadays you can go online, you can go to eBay. But back then, it was just Eugene Stopeck. And he was always looking for stuff. As Adam said, for Gene, going to estate sales and auctions was sport. He was always on the prowl. He was always looking for pianos. Even after my mother died 2 years ago, he calls me up and says, Mark, I found a 7-foot Bosendorfer. This is a big piano. I was like, Dad, I don't have, he says, do you know anyone who might want it? Maybe you want it. It's like, me? So he was always had his sight on things, and he began to know what his customers wanted, and he was buying and selling. Even during the pandemic, I called him to see how he was doing. He says, well, keep me busy. I have some things on eBay. I'm selling these hangers. He said, hangers? He says, yeah, like hangers, like you put in a closet. I was like, well, what kind of hangers are you selling? He's like, these are Chanel hangers. They're from the Chanel store. I found a box of 20 of them in the trash room. I'm selling them for $20 each. I mean, that was classic Eugene Stopeck. He saw what any of us would have seen was a box in the trash room. And what as he actually said, it was like someone left a box filled with $20 bills. And this led to the picture that's on your program. Is the picture from his antique roadshow that he did at the condo at 990, which was a popular event. The various 990 people here will say how much Gene was in his element. at the Eugene Stopeck Antique Roadshow, where he would tell people sometimes that the box that the item came in was worth more than the item. I think that, Eugene Stopeck, the nightclub manager, the fundraiser, the antique dealer, the investor. I didn't even really get into the investor. The condo board president. If we think about this bringing the mambo to Brooklyn, and we think of it as a metaphor, that we're all Brooklyn. And Gene never stopped bringing the mambo. Take you off.
I'm here from Terry and Lena and Nervin.
Ladies and gentlemen, I stand before you today, humbled and honored to say goodbye to a dear neighbor and friend, a friend with whom I shared a remarkable and extraordinary friendship and journey for over 18 years. Our bond was built on mutual trust, deep admiration, as well as the kind of understanding that transcended all differences. He was more than a friend. He was an encyclopedia of life. He knew everything about it. Symphonies, operas, from Beethoven to Mozart, from Mahler to Bruckner, all the way to Britney Spears, Taylor Swift. He had a passion for melodies and rhythms that spanned centuries in genre. You often hear him whistling in the hall. His knowledge of politics, local, national, international, was unmatched. He could recite the nuances of history and the intricacies of religious texts. He not only understood the Torah and the Talmud, but could also engage with the New Testament and the Quran, bridging wisdoms from all faiths. He was someone who saw potential in others. When I told him once that I wanted to be a member of the board of our high-rise building, and I failed, he said, "You should not be sad, because failure sometimes can be something that leads to sadness. But the greatest sadness is not to try and fail, but to fail to try." He invited me to join his group. He knew my heart was in having fun in our building and beautifying our building, so he put me on the recreation commission and gave me a free hand. And we worked together side by side. Side by side. His generosity did not stop there, but he was the life of our community, whether hosting and welcoming new members in our building in high-rise, or organizing events. And the setup was never complete without lighting the candles. His antique roadshow program was legendary. He taught us that the only three things that you should keep in your house, besides your wife, is sterling silver, Persian rugs, and original antique paintings. His knowledge of estate sales and stocks were unparalleled. And although he did not always win, he certainly knew how to make a good bargain. He was a straightforward man, honest, and if you didn't like what he said, it was your problem, not his. His honesty was refreshing in a world that often tiptoes around the truth, as we see these days. His memory, especially later in life, was nothing but remarkable. He could recall the minutiae of 9/11, which he lived through, the minutiae of civil war, Einstein's theory of relativity, and the details of movie actors and actresses. He was a world traveler. He was a scholar. He was a man who lived his life fully into the hills. He taught us about financial responsibility in ways both profound and humorous. Like when he would tell us to buy a watch for $5 because the box was worth $50 on eBay. He once told my daughter that a $12 potato in a high-end restaurant was really only worth 60 cents in the grocery store. When we go out together, he will tell the server to bring the dish as the chef made. No fat-free, no dairy-free, no salt-free, no gluten-free, just as the chef made it. Just as the chef made it. He lived his life to the hill. He was strong, brave, unafraid of controversy, unyielding in his convictions. His influence will be timeless. Today I am proud to have known him. Today I am proud to have called him my friend. I'm proud to honor him in this way. Our friendship was a testament to the beauty of diversity and the strength of human connection and human spirit. May his memory be a blessing, and may we continue to live by his example and by the lessons that he taught us and he shared with us. Rest in peace, my dear friend. You will never be forgotten. Goodbye, my friend.
I was so happy to see the picture I took of Gene on the cover. I was really thrilled. I took this photo of Gene. I have many photos of him with Terry or by himself. Gene here was doing what he loves to do the most. This was the antique roadshow that he always used to give this time of the year, in October. But this year he decided he wanted to do it in May and not in October. I think he had the feeling that he would not be here with us today. Gene was amazing, and as my husband was saying, we learned a lot from him. He was very dynamic, he was full of knowledge, he was smart, he was funny, and I remember I asked him one time, I had a vase that I broke, and I said, Gene, what do you think the value of this vase? And it was so funny, he looked at the back and he said, made in China, $20. And you know, again what Terry said, my husband, we learned from him that only few things that are, valuable, and the rest is all sentimental. You become attached to things. We recently downsized, and I was extremely sentimental about letting go of things, but I kept thinking what Gene said, none of it really has value unless it's like really antique or sterling silver or a fancy Persian rug. But other than that, don't worry. And so you begin to really not worry so much about what you have, because it's really no big deal. And it simplified my life a lot. And he encouraged me, he's like, use the silver, put it in the dishwasher, don't be afraid, just do it. And I'm forever grateful to all the advice that he gave me in life. And he always loved, actually, my cooking. He loved the food that I used to make, or that I still make. But I think he loved the most, I made lentil soup, and he loved it. And I will never eat lentil soup without thinking of Gene and how much he loved it. Thank you, Gene, for everything that you taught us and taught me, especially in life. I'm forever appreciative. I will never forget you and Faye. I love her so much. You will forever be in our hearts, both of you, the best neighbors in the world. Thank you.
So to add a few short thoughts and words to Mark Terragina's beautiful memories and recollections. When I first came here to the synagogue about 10 years ago, Gene and Faye were big personalities in the synagogue. They often came and holding court in their corner, and always impeccably dressed, and obviously very cultured. And they had a very warm and direct way of New Yorkers. One noticed straight away to pull people into their orbit. As Mark mentioned, he had the accent to go with it. But whenever I heard Gene, I thought, he's from the old country, not Eastern Europe in Brooklyn. He especially loved anything that was musical. If there was a musical event, they were always there and effusive about it, or social evenings, or if there was anything with Mark and Janelle and Isaac there. They would come to anything with their family. So naturally, when we first moved here, they wanted to get to know us a little bit, so they invited us to the famous condo before my kids were born, I think. So they started to share some of their interests, and music was obviously a big part, because half of their living room was taken up by these huge pianos. And Gene taught my wife and I more about silver in half an hour than we knew for our whole life. We just could always feel they had such a tremendous passion for his interest, and he communicated, and he wanted us to know all the details of all of it, and he had tips that he shared with everyone else. And to this day, whenever we go to the CSO, we always sit where we can see the hands of the pianist. And I always had the sense that they had a special gift for knowing how to build the life that they loved. And they just transported that life from New York to Chicago and created, except here they have family too. And Adam's family was closer. Gene also had this playful side that we've been talking about. I remember once being in the car with him, and he was behind the wheel. He became very much a New Yorker. As we drove to a nearby cafe, he had no problem telling the jaywalkers what he thought that they should do. He was very generous too, and then when my daughter was born 9 years ago, there was a custom to give silver as a gift at the birth of a child. And my parents were coming in from abroad, and they wanted to buy something, so he found a perfect and lovely gift for them to then give to my daughter. Later, we did try to get Gina on the board, and at first he said, "No way, I'm too deep into my condo board." And he said, I was on the board of my temple for 15 years, as Mark said, and I did all their fundraising, So I'm done with all the board stuff. In the end, we did get her to serve on the board, and it was great. I remember that when Faye was passing away, he was very devoted on her side, and he was tender and often overcome with emotion. He showed it in his own way. But then when it happened, he was resigned. This is what life brought him. It was the same for his own life, and just a few days ago, Mark shared with me that when he went to his doctor's office, just last month, a few weeks ago, they changed to a concierge system, and they asked him, well, can you pay your annual fee now? And he refused, and then they insisted, and he responded bluntly, this is my last visit, I'm dying. So I was on sabbatical over the summer, so the last time that I saw Gene was last spring. I saw him in the kosher aisle of the supermarket up north before Passover, and he was buying matzah, I think, and saw him and he made some jokes about matzah. He was very warm and nice. And I asked him about himself, how he was doing. He said to me, I have all these health issues, but what can you do? And I think a lot of us often will say something like that. With him, he really meant it. Janelle told me that he said his goodbyes to family just a few weeks ago. When he did it, she asked him, well, how did you feel? He said, I'm never giving it a second thought. I am ready. And the other occasion that I saw him was he came to hear Isaac read Torah. And there was this awesome moment on our lectern on the Bima. There were 3 generations all together. It was Mark, who's very involved here, and teaches here, and gets taught by our religious school, adult education. Isaac is one of our only 20-somethings who still comes back to read Torah for us. And Gene was kveldt over all of it. And so it was Yehuda ben Yitzchak, that was Gene, there was Mendel ben Yehuda Mark, and there was Yitzchak ben Mendel, 3rd generation Isaac. And they were all together in this little space. It was wonderful to see. I think that despite being an engineer and having this mind for details, Gene in some way really was a free spirit. He lived the way he wanted to live, and maybe the whole family does too. Mark told me that some of the ladies from Gene and Faye's group back on Long Island said, you are very lucky. You have the only parents in our group who would have allowed their son to go to art school. As Janelle said, his default mode that we experienced was to lead. But if you took the lead, he was always happy to follow and to support you. He had this tremendous love for his family and a unique way of going about life. I'd like to end with 2 thoughts. One is, Adam shared with me, which I had never quite noticed, that Gene was always whistling. His whole life, he was always whistling. And in the last 6 months, when Adam was living with Gene to kind of care for him, he knew Gene was doing well. When he would walk up from an errand, he could hear him whistling even in the hallway. And then he knew he didn't have to ask how he was doing. So I asked Adam, well, what would Gene whistle? He said, well, he was always whistling show tunes or melodies from the old military movies. He had that encyclopedic knowledge. And there's even a picture of him and Faye on a cruise ship. You can see he's whistling. And I thought that his whistling speaks to his innate positivity. He had to say he was cheerful and positive about life. And his whistling communicated some of the peace that he felt with the world. He was in tune and in harmony with himself and the world around him. And that carried him through much of his life. And finally, I'd like to share a Hasidic story about the Hasidic master Reb Zusia. And so it's said about Reb Zusia of Antipol that on his deathbed he turned to his family and said, when I go to heaven, they will not ask me, why weren't you more like Moses? They're going to ask you, why weren't you more like Zusia? Gene had his own unique way of being in the world, walking in the world. He had this incredible spirit and flair. He gave a lot. And he also enjoyed life. He put himself fully into everything he did. When he goes to heaven, nobody's going to ask him, why weren't you more like Eugene Stopeck? Eugene was always perfectly and impeccably himself. Please rise for the El Mali Rockin'. Exalted, compassionate God, grant infinite rest in your sheltering presence among the holy and pure. Soul of Eugene Stopeck, who has gone to his eternal home. Merciful one, we ask our loved one find perfect peace in your eternal embrace. May his soul be bound up in the bond of life. May he rest in peace. Let us say, Amen.
Please be seated. The interment is going to take place at Jewish Oak Ridge Cemetery in Hillside. We will have a funeral procession. However, you're also welcome to go on your own if you prefer. The address is on Roosevelt Road, west of Mannheim Road, and the address is 4301 Roosevelt Road, Hillside. If you go in the main Oak Ridge entrance, if you're not going in the procession, once you're through the entrance, the Jewish section is all the way on the west side of the cemetery. For those of you who will be driving in the procession, we will either give you a flag and or a sticker to put in your inside right portion of your windshield. The flag is on top of the car. Drive with your high beam headlights on and your flashers on. You are welcome to follow the hearse through a red light if the light turns, but please be very conscious on direction. You have to drive safely. People are on their phones. After the interment, the rabbi's already mentioned that the family will be receiving calls of condolence until 6 tonight. That'll be at 1108 South Humphrey in Oak Park at the Stopeck residence. The following have been asked to act as pallbearers. Grandson Isaac, John Dempsey, Jill Dempsey, Jody Nelson, Don Nelson, Dean Karish, Brett Thompson, I'm sorry, I don't remember what he had right. Brett Thompson and Larry Smith. At this time, if everybody would please rise and the pallbearers would please come up to the casket.
Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. Leads me beside still waters. Restores my soul. Guides me in straight paths for his name's sake. I walk in the valley of the shadow of death. I shall fear no evil. Thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff comfort me. Prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. I shall dwell in the house of the Lord. Shanti Viveta Dana,